Good evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome to the City of Palo Alto's first Wellness Wednesday event. I'm Kristen O'Kane, Community Services Director. Our new Wellness Wednesday series will be held every third Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. and will feature a topic focused on community health and well-being. You can see the upcoming schedule at www.cityofpaloalto.org/bewell. And if you aren't able to attend the live version of the events, we will be recording them and posting them on the website. I now have the honor of introducing our first event, Introduction to Mindfulness with Palo Alto Police Chief Bob Jonsen. Chief Jonsen has been in law enforcement since 1986. Prior to his appointment as police chief for Palo Alto, he was the chief of police for Menlo Park for 5 years, and prior to that, worked for the LA County Sheriff's Department for 27 years. Chief Jonsen became a certified instructor for compassion cultivation training in 2018, a program developed at Stanford, and became a trained mindfulness facilitator in 2020. He is also a peer coach for resilience immersion training, a program designed specifically for public safety personnel and developed by the Mindful Badge Initiative and the University of San Diego. Chief Jonsen has facilitated mindfulness to public safety personnel throughout California and has witnessed the profound impact it has had for participants, both professionally and personally. Chief Jonsen has co-developed resiliency programs for public service with Courageous Heart, the human behind the badge, now being offered to law enforcement agencies across the state. Chief Jonsen also facilitates the city's resiliency training program available for the city of Palo Alto. Chief Jonsen believes it's essential to provide personnel with the best training possible so everyone can live healthy lives, physically, mentally, and emotionally, while serving their communities. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Chief Jonsen.
And Chief Jonsen told you to keep it simple. So thank you for that introduction, Kristen. And for everyone watching, and I wish we were back in the world of being in person so we could engage with each other and enjoy our company together. But we're doing this virtually, and I have to say I'm extremely excited, honored, and truly humbled to be asked to participate with you on this first City of Palo Alto's Wellness Wednesday. You know, each week, as Kristen said, the city will host an event focused on community wellness and well-being. And there's probably no more important time than today and the current environment we're living in to bring mindfulness to the forefront. So again, I'm extremely excited to be part of this, and thank you. And I know we can't really interact because of the platform, but if we could just silently all wish a big happy birthday to Kristen, Director O'Kane. It is her birthday, and yet here she is with us this afternoon. So happy birthday, and we wish you well. Most of you have to be wondering, with everything going on in the world, and even here in Palo Alto, why is a police chief talking about mindfulness? Well, because I'm just like you. And, you know, I have found, and I'll speak for myself, this past year to be extremely challenging, both personally and professionally. Just like many of you, I've been restricted from seeing some of the people that are most important in my life. And that's been very challenging. And especially for me, being a grandfather to a young grandson, and I'll take just a brief moment to do the grandparent thing and have to show a photo. But I miss this young boy dearly, and the ability to interact with him in his first year on this planet. And that's been challenging because my son and my grandson and my son's wife, they all live out of state. So with travel restrictions and all the things involved, it has been a very rare opportunity for me to get out there and engage with that beautiful young boy. But on the professional side, and I'll be completely honest, not knowing what all of you do for a living, but I will clearly state that for me professionally, and I've been in this profession in law enforcement, serving communities for 35 years, without question, it's been the most challenging year of my career for multiple reasons. And we'll get into a little bit of that as we go on. But one of the positive things about today is we're starting to see normalcy, if that's the correct word, starting to return into our lives. The COVID pandemic, without question, has altered every aspect of the American life, from health and work to education to exercise to family engagement, and even in interaction and training and opportunities. Over the long term, we'll have to wait and see how all this plays out. But one of the things I can say is the American Psychological Association, which began doing monthly surveys at the beginning of the pandemic on American health and well-being, has already come out and said that the negative impacts and the mental health effects of the pandemic may be serious and long-lasting. So, in fairness to the pandemic, that's not the sole source of our stress. And for me, in my profession, following the death of George Floyd, that has changed our world in law enforcement and how we're interacting and serving our communities, and some for a very good way. But what it's done for Americans is also caused another layer of stress. In fact, again, out of one of those surveys, they identified the future, or the uncertainty of our future in this country, is at an all-time high, and it came in at about 83%. Now, previous highs have been reported, and stress has been going on in our country for many, many years. And for the history books, the pandemic nor the George Floyd death is the sole responsibility or sole cause for all our woes. Stress has been prevalent in America for many years. And in fact, I always like to share research and some survey results that came out 8 years ago through the work of Harvard University and the Forum of Public Health and the Huffington Post. And remember, this was back in 2013, and it's still significant because what they found back then is that 70% of Americans reported experiencing physical or psychological symptoms of stress. 70%. But actually, to me, and why I share this particular survey, and it always rings true in my head, is the other aspect of the survey that was disclosed is that they found that 1 out of every 3 Americans experiences extreme stress. Well, think about that. 1 out of every 3 Americans, and that was 8 years ago. I'm pretty sure, I'm not a researcher, but I'd love to see those same questions asked today, because I have to believe with everything that we're going through as a society, that 1 out of 3 has probably become closer to 1 out of 1 American is experiencing extreme stress in their life in some capacity or another. I got involved in mindfulness back in 2015, and it's an interesting circle and how things happen. And at the time, to be honest with you, I had never heard of mindfulness. It was not something that was part of the conversation of law enforcement training. And I realized very quickly after exploring what mindfulness was and jumping into an immersion program about it, I only wish I had had that training and that foundation 35 years ago when I entered this profession of public service. And I've come to believe that it's extremely valuable for all of us, because not just police officers or public servants, all of us experience stress in our life, and it's about finding ways to mitigate that stress. Today, I've become a firm believer that mindfulness can help us build resiliency and really can help us find improvements in virtually every aspect of our life. Yes, in decreasing stress and improving our overall health, both in body and mind. This is something that I really will say that if I did not have this foundation coming into the last couple of years, the stressors of life would have or could have been overwhelming. And I know many Americans are feeling overwhelmed right now. So, what's going on with us, and why is this becoming such an issue? Well, I mean, all we really have to do is think about it for a moment and think about the process that happens and the things that we're exposed to every day. Our minds are constantly at work. That's no secret. Right now, as you're sitting here listening to me, yes, you may be processing what I'm saying. You may be seeing my words or hearing my voice, but you also have a lot of other things going through your mind. Maybe you're still thinking about things that happened during the day or news that you read about or some of the tragedies going on in our society. Maybe your thoughts are occupied by things that you still have to do. Our minds are equipped to do that. We process things rapidly and constantly. If I were to take you just briefly into my own mind with some of the thoughts that are constantly going around, they'd constantly be bouncing from one thing to another. We have the great ability to multitask, and it would continue on throughout the day. And most of us in any normal day are going to process really between 20,000 to 100,000 thoughts per day. I'm probably closer into the range of 80 to 90,000 because there's constantly new information coming in. And that's okay. But what starts to happen, or is possibly can happen, is we start to get fixated on one particular thought. We start to ruminate about it over and over and over again. And this is something that's been well researched. And it really was a fascinating study that came out of Harvard University a couple of years ago, where two psychologists realized and identified that nearly 50% of our thoughts during our waking hours is thinking about something other than what we're supposed to be doing. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 50% of the time, we're thinking about something other than the task at hand. Well, again, we make it through the day, we do pretty well. But what they also found in that study is that a vast majority of those thoughts lead to typically making us unhappy. And by default, we normally sometimes think about things that are not pleasant, the negative aspects that are going on in our life. We gravitate to that sometimes. So it's finding ways to mitigate this and so we can use it to our advantage. And just in end of 2019, one of our experts locally at Stanford University declared that mindfulness, or not being distractible, will become the most important work skill of the 21st century. Not being distractible will become the most important work skill of the 21st century. Well, think about it. There's a lot of fascinating information out there about our thought process and how our body responds to our thoughts and everything else. And the amount of information that is available and the speed at which it comes into our body is at a rate of unprecedented magnitude. We're constantly being exposed to different stimulus, different information. These things, as much as we love them, you got to learn to hate them because it's constant information that's accessible any given moment. And that can become distracting in itself. And just so I'm clear, I don't want to imply that stress is always a bad thing. In fact, I'm a huge advocate for one of our other local experts, and I highly recommend, not that this is a book read, but Kelly McGonigal, who's at Stanford University, has a best-selling book, The Upside of Stress, and she really frames it that way. Not all stress is bad, but it's how we frame it that's important. So let's talk about that for a moment. One of the things that happens with all this thought process is that our brains start to become overwhelmed. And what's happening in our brains, without getting too far into it, and I know I have some very, very smart people with us today that can probably explain it much more eloquently than I can. But the reality is, all that stimulus activates parts of our brain, which influences how we respond. Our bodies are amazingly equipped to survive. Unfortunately, the amount of stimulus that's coming in has catapulted us into a society where we're constantly functioning in this constant dominant state of the sympathetic nervous system. So briefly, to break that down again, going back to when we were teenagers, we were all introduced to the importance of the central nervous system, the control center of our body. And we were probably briefed and educated on the different aspects of the nervous system. And the two primary parts, if you remember, at least I remembered from high school, was that sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight aspect of our nervous system, which is designed for survival and has been integrated into us for many millions of years, right? And we respond just like that to a threat in order to fight or flight or to freeze. That's what it's designed to do, is help us survive. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is really where we should be operating a vast majority of our day. That's where we're more relaxed, we can digest, we can recover, we can recuperate. But what's happening with all this influx of information and these stressors that have now been considered more threatening to us, whether they're truly life-threatening is debatable, but our bodies and our minds are perceiving them as threats. So we're processing and preparing the body and the mind as if they are true threats. And what happens in that process is different hormones start to get released, and we start elevating our cortisol and our adrenaline levels. And that kind of leads us into that hyperactive, constant dominant state of the sympathetic nervous system. And that's where it can become a problem, as mentioned earlier in one of the studies. Being in that chronic stress or having extreme stress, constantly exposed to it, that's where we can start to have health, both in body and mind, health issues. So this is something that we really need to pay attention to, but there's a way we can solve the problem or at least mitigate the problem. And that's what I've learned through mindfulness and compassion training, is that through meditation, we can actually help activate our parasympathetic nervous system, and we can dramatically reduce many of the negative effects that the sympathetic nervous system imposes on us. The lifespan of the sympathetic nervous system should be temporary. It should only be there to help us survive the threat, a true threat, not to constantly be operating in that mode. Because when we are operating in that mode, we're not in a relaxed state, we're not digesting as we should, and we're not recuperating as we should. So it's finding a way to, again, deal with the complexity of this system that can really lead to a more relaxed state of being. And that's where mindfulness comes in. And yes, this is an introduction to mindfulness. So let's start with the definition that we're working from. Mindfulness, for those that have never really heard or explored the possibility of what it is, by definition, and I'm going to use the working definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn. For those that aren't familiar with Jon Kabat-Zinn, he's someone I would personally consider to be really the founding members of American mindfulness. And I say that because he's the one that really brought these practices that have been in society for thousands of years over into the Western culture. And rather than I talk and explain it, I'm actually going to show you a very brief video by Jon Kabat-Zinn explaining the value of mindfulness and how it helps us deal with chronic pain and stress. But this is his working definition. It's awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present, non-judgmentally. Where we right now are having difficulties is staying in the present moment, and especially to do it non-judgmentally. So let me go ahead and transition and let you hear from Jon Kabat-Zinn himself.
So we'll just do an introduction to start.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so can you introduce yourself and explain what you do in the general context of your practice with people and your research and your writing as well?
Okay, well, how long do you want me to talk for? My name is Jon Kabat-Zinn, and I'm a professor of medicine emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And the work that I do revolves around the clinic that I started 34 years ago now called the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic, or MBSR. And the idea of this clinic back in 1979 when it started was an experiment to see whether we could actually catch people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system and introduce them to fairly intensive Buddhist meditative practices without the Buddhism, and see if that couldn't add a whole other dimension to their trajectory towards greater levels of health and well-being, starting where they were, which is with, for the most part, fairly extensive chronic diseases, which they had on average for about 7 or 8 years. Lots of chronic pain patients, people with heart disease, with various kinds of cancer, with headaches, you name it, we would take it, because when you put out stress as the overall umbrella in which things come to you, well, everything is stressful, you know, to different people. So any kind of chronic medical condition either is caused by stress or compounds the stress in your life. So it was a very, very big umbrella and an invitation for people to see what they could do for themselves that no one else on the planet can really do for you, utilizing these meditative practices that really have to do with paying attention when you boil it right down. So there's nothing particularly magical or mystical about it, but to cultivate this muscle that we have intentionally to pay attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally, which is my working definition of mindfulness, and see what would happen. And that's exactly what we did. And even in 1979, when our healthcare system was very, very different from the way it is now, people were falling through the cracks. I would say that nowadays it's no longer cracks, it's like chasms. People are falling through the chasms of the healthcare system. And Ralph Snyderman, who was chancellor at Duke University Medical Center for 10 years, wrote a paper with Andy Weil, the first sentence, I think, of which was, "The chassis is broken and the wheels are falling off," to describe how ineffective medical care, especially for chronic medical conditions, could be. So the idea of getting the patient to participate fully in his or her own movement towards greater levels of health and well-being by cultivating these deep, you could call them interior resources. And let's say, what would those be, those deep interior resources that attention might actually cultivate? Well, they would be learning, which means changing the patterns by which you understand things. And that has everything to do with apprehension through our senses and through how the senses get organized in the brain and combined with cognition and emotion. So learning, and then out of the learning, growing. Out of the growing, a certain kind of coming to terms with things that may be very difficult to come to terms with, and that is my working definition of healing. And then transformation. And transformation in the sense of usually we have a very diminished notion of who we actually are. And we have a narrative, a story of who I am and how I'm good at this and no good at that. And very often they're more on the negative side than on the positive side. And one of the hopes was that people would actually cultivate, through direct realization of who they are, a much bigger understanding and a much bigger, you could say, narrative, or just give up the narrative entirely and live life as if it really mattered and not worry about your PR. And so this is now 34 years later. It turned out to be a model that was very appropriate, and it was almost felt like we were giving food to starving people, to offer them this kind of a stress reduction clinic where they could participate in this way and cultivate these deep muscles of attention, awareness, kindness towards oneself, and self-compassion. And of course, it was also very stress reducing for the doctors, because when you're not actually able to help people with chronic medical problems, you don't feel that good either. So if you have some place that you can send people to roll up their sleeves and do a certain kind of work for themselves that you can't do for them, that is very satisfying from the point of view of the doctor. And then the patient will come back and say things like, and this happened early on in the stress reduction clinic, I remember it very clearly, "Thank you for sending me to the stress reduction clinic. That was the best thing you ever did for me." And of course, it's not a critique of the doctor, criticism of the doctor, but it's saying, you put me in touch with myself. And that's easy to say in words, but it has a certain, once you're practicing these meditative approaches, it's like dropping into an aspect of being that's been here all along but completely hidden. But imagine if you made that like your default mode and you actually cultivated that way of being embodied in the world without having to make things happen in a kind of appearance sort of way, but where the essence was, in some sense, nurturing you. I think that has an enormous potential for actually giving rise to balance within the organism on virtually every level, from the brain to our chromosomes to epigenetic factors and telomerase factors and all of those kinds of things, so that the more you are like integrated in yourself, the healthier you are.
You've just answered my first 5 questions, which is wonderful.
I love listening to him, and I love the phrase he uses, balancing the organism. You know, the power of the mind and the breath, which I have come to really believe is extremely powerful. Jon Kabat-Zinn summarizes really giving people the practice to help them cultivate their inner resources so they can heal themselves. And I want to just take a moment to give you a little insight to answering the question, why me? Why is Bob Jonsen, the chief of Palo Alto, speaking on mindfulness? And let me just take you back a few years. As I mentioned, I was introduced to it in 2015, but I'm going to take you back a little further just to give you some idea of who I am and the value that this has had in my life. And I don't do it to say, woe is me. I do it because I truly don't believe the things that I've been exposed to in my life are a whole lot different than many of you. Yes, the experiences that I've faced may be different, but the stressors, we all have them. And that's why I share this. So in 2015, how mindfulness actually came into my sphere of influence was my mayor. I was the chief of Menlo Park at the time. And my mayor had asked me if I had ever thought of mindfulness for law enforcement. And I remember saying to her, and this was over coffee, this conversation, saying, I've never heard of it. And I definitely am not hearing about it in our profession. So I would have to say no. But she was the mayor and she asked me at least to look into it, which I did. So that's where my journey began, but it really began many, many, many years before. And I'm not going to go all the way back, but one of the things I think is important is, again, my life is, I grew up in Northern California, grew up in a neighborhood and a community which was really stress-free, in my opinion. I had a lot of things that happened to me young in my life, but I don't look back and say that I lived a tragic childhood. I actually have very fond memories, even though I had a very active childhood, meaning we moved a lot of different schools. And when I was 19, my dad told me it was time for me to move on from Northern California because there was more to life than what I had been exposed to up to that point. So I literally packed all my belongings in my car and I drove to Los Angeles, got an apartment, thought I'd spend a semester down there and come home when my dad cooled down. Well, life took hold. By 22, I was engaged to be married. And by 23, we had our first son. And by the time I was 25, I realized I really needed a job. And I had already applied to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and been hired. And by 25, I had my first patrol assignment in South Central Los Angeles. And I'll never forget, this was in the late 80s, I'll never forget that one of my first calls was a gang-related shooting where my training officer and I arrived. And to this day, I remember that young man lying on the sidewalk who had been killed at point blank range by another gang member. And I consider that a memory marker, a trauma that I was exposed to. And it was a trauma because it's something I'd never really seen in my life, an actual dead body in front of me at that close proximity. And unfortunately, over the next 6 years that I spent in that area working patrol, I was exposed to that kind of trauma almost on a weekly basis. The violence was something I had never been exposed to before. It was frequent and it was extremely violent. The gang-related shootings in the late 80s in South Central Los Angeles were pretty prolific. So it was something we responded to on a very frequent occasion. And there was other stressors that compounded over my career. And I never really thought about what was happening to me at the time. I just took it all in and absorbed it. And what I did realize by the time I was 35, I was on 2 blood pressure medicines and a cholesterol medicine due to my health. By my 40s, I was having issues with sleep. And those became pretty profound, meaning every night I'd wake up 2:30, 3 in the morning and wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. By my late 40s and early 50s, I was now having not only sleep issues, I was having significant digestive problems. And I'm a stubborn person, so I never go to the doctor. And all these things just compounding. And I kept rationalizing it in my head that it's just getting older. So I accepted it. And it wasn't until I went to that mindfulness training in 2015, and there were other things we could talk about, but they're just experiences. And each of you have your experiences that you could probably reflect on. But what I realized when I left that training on mindfulness, I felt more energized, more relaxed, and more refreshed than I ever had in decades. And that's where my journey began because I immersed myself into what Kristen described, a lot of cultivating compassion training, a lot of mindfulness training, and I haven't stopped since. Because if I can have the benefits that I received, maybe other people can experience the same benefits. What do I mean by that? Well, immediately after that first initial training, I realized the anxiety that I had around my body at all times, it had built to that level, was gone. And on my drive home from Oregon on that particular day, I remember feeling really energized and excited because I wasn't feeling stressed and anxious anymore. And within days, I realized I was sleeping better. And once I started sleeping better, within about a month or two, or maybe a little longer, I started realizing my digestive problems were resolving. Within 18 months from the moment I left that resiliency training to the moment I went to my cardiologist in June of 2017, and to give you an indication of my blood pressure, it had never really been stable since I was 35. And there was a point in 2015 that it was 220 over 180. And I know I have some doctors probably out here. 220 over 180 is not healthy by any stretch of the imagination. And fortunately, I was able to find something to help me mitigate what I was confronting. And that's where, again, when I went to that cardiologist for a checkup in June of 2017, my blood pressure was at 120 over 80. She was very appreciative that I'd been taking my medication. But the reality is, I hadn't been taking it for 6 months. I had found a way, and just for disclosure, I am not advocating for anybody to stop taking any medicines you're on, but I had found a way that worked for me. And it's worked for me ever since. So I've continued with it. And how does it work? Well, if the point is reducing our stress, we need to settle our mind. And that's where the power of the breath can come into play. And I want to introduce you to really how we can do this by focusing in, as that one Stanford psychologist, paying attention, the importance of that, focusing in, as John Kabat-Zinn said, to one particular thing for a set amount of time to just allow our minds to settle down a little bit. And by doing that, our bodies will calm as well. So what we do is we introduce various meditative practices, and one of them is a breath focus practice. So I would love to do that with you this afternoon, if you're so willing. And I know it's difficult because you're in a different place than I am, but we can still do it because all you have to do is listen to the sound of my voice. But what I'd like to do is guide you through a breath focus practice. And it's a very introductory practice that works really well for people beginning their meditation. And what it does, it helps us focus on our breath, and we'll use that as what I call an anchor. I'm going to invite you to explore a couple of ways we can do this, but I'm going to explore and invite you to test these different anchors of your breath. Then I'm going to ask you to choose one that works for you or appears to be working for you. And then we're going to actually go into a formal practice for just a few minutes of you doing nothing other than constantly going back to your focus of the breath. Fair enough? Let's give it a shot. So what I'd like you to do, if you're not already in a comfortable position, I'd actually like you to find a comfortable position, and especially if you've never meditated before, and some of you, I know, I'm looking at the list, are very seasoned practitioners. So I don't have to really tell you how to find that position. You know, whether it's in a chair, on a cushion, on the floor, find a position where you feel comfortable and stable. And why this is somewhat important is because we're trying to settle the body and the mind. And if you're constantly fidgeting, you're activating the mind. So the more still you can be, the better. With all that said, I'm going to give you a moment, find that position in your chair, wherever it may be, or on your cushion or on your couch, wherever it is, just to get comfortable. And then I'm going to invite you, if you're comfortable in doing so and you're in a safe place in doing so, is to close your eyes or lower your gaze. Now, some of you may be wondering, why do I have to do that? You don't have to do anything. It's an invitation. The reason I invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze is it helps reduce the stimulus. Humans, we are constantly using our eyes to scan, and we pick up different things, looking at different things. We're activating our system all the time just through our sense of sight. So by closing that, it diminishes quite a bit of that sensory input. So I would invite you to just close your eyes and settle in. And if you've done that, then just take a moment to check in with yourself. See how the body feels. See where your mind is at. Are you with us? Are you present? Or are you multitasking? If so, that's okay. Acknowledge it, and then just have an open mind about the next few minutes of doing your best to focus. And now what I'm going to introduce to you is, as we're sitting here, we're settling in. I want you to begin by just taking a couple of deep settling breaths or deep cleansing breaths. And what these are is slow inhalation through your nose with a slow exhalation out. Breathing in through your nose, breathing out through your mouth. Just a couple of these can be tremendously beneficial in activating and transitioning to your parasympathetic nervous system. So breathe in through your nose, breathe out through your mouth. We strengthen the vagal tone just by doing those deep cleansing breaths. Once you've done a few of those, go ahead and settle into the natural rhythm of your breath. No need to try to change it or regulate it. Just take a moment to settle into that natural rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. And as you're breathing in and you're breathing out, as your thoughts start to drift away, recognize it, acknowledge it, but then just come back to this moment, this space, breath by breath, just feeling it, feeling the air come in, the air go out. Now I'll invite you to explore a couple of options as your breath-focused anchor. And the first will be focusing in on the sensation of your breath. So as you're sitting here and you're breathing in and out, try to connect and become acutely aware of the sensation that causes, where it resonates with you. Are you sensing the cold air come through your nostrils as you breathe in, and the warm air pass through as you exhale? Do you notice the nostrils flaring as you inhale, and collapse as you exhale? Maybe you're noticing the rise and fall of your chest. For some, you may be noticing the expansion and contraction of your diaphragm as you breathe in and you breathe out. Just take a moment to see what part of breathing in and out connects with you. And if you really start to dial into one aspect of that sensation, maybe you'll choose to use that as your anchor as we begin our formal practice. But for those that maybe not connecting with any aspect of your breath, here's another option for you to explore. Try just labeling your breath. As you breathe in, silently say, inhale. As you breathe out, silently say, exhale. Inhale, exhale. If you start to wander and your mind drifts away, acknowledge it and go back to the breath, constantly returning to your anchor. Now, if the labeling doesn't really work for you, one way that's very effective for people, especially in the beginning, is to count your breath. So let's try that as your anchor. And it's as simple as doing just that. With each breath, as you inhale and you exhale, count 1. Inhale, exhale, count 2. And continue until you reach the number 10. And if you reach the number 10, just start over again. If at any point you've wandered away, recognize it, acknowledge it, come back to counting again. So what I'd like you to do is choose one of those as your official anchor for the next few minutes, and we'll do 3 minutes of it. So I want you to say which one works for me. The sensation of the breath, the labeling of the breath, or the counting of the breath. And now that you've chosen one, I'm going to go ahead and begin the formal practice, this breath focus practice. And remember, your mind is going to drift. Your thoughts are going to wander. That's normal. That's by default how it's already operating. The challenge is to recognize it, acknowledge it, and non-judgmentally bring yourself back to your focus on the breath. Repetition after repetition, breath after breath. So now that you've chosen your breath focused anchor, go ahead and settle in to the focus of the breath, utilizing your anchor as much as you need to. Go ahead and begin. We're approaching 1 minute. If you've already realized your thoughts have taken you away, acknowledge it, take yourself back to your anchor, and begin again to focus on the breath. Approaching 2 minutes. If you realize your thought train is off and running, try to step off that train onto the platform, let the train go down the tracks, go back to your anchor. As we approach 3 minutes, I want to go ahead and have you drop your focus on the breath, doing another internal scan of both body and mind. Are you feeling a little more relaxed, a little calmer? With each out breath, are you able to let a little bit go? Each out breath feeling a little more relaxed in your forehead. Allow the micro muscles around your eyes to just relax. Feeling the relaxation in your jaw, your whole face. Allowing both body and mind just to settle into this moment, breath by breath. Feeling the relaxation in your neck, your shoulders, your entire body. Now, in a moment, you'll hear the sound of the bell that'll end this practice. And if you've closed your eyes or lower your gaze, I'd invite you to keep it that way, and as long as you can hear the sound of the bell and savor the moment. And then when you can no longer hear the sound, then go ahead, open your eyes and come back to this space. So this is a part, as much as I love having the capability of connecting with you, even in these times, this is a time I really wish we had the opportunity to be together so we could have that conversation of what that experience was like for you. Um, for many, as a first-time practitioner or first-time meditating, sometimes they immediately see the value, sometimes they don't. But if you did find value in just those brief few minutes of practicing, maybe you want to utilize this breath focus practice. And by no means is it the only form of meditation. There are thousands of different types of meditation, but this seems to be one that works well, especially for beginning meditators. There's a fascinating book, which I would love, maybe you've all read it, Altered Traits, written by two of the pioneers in mindfulness, Richie Davidson and Daniel Goleman. But it talks about the effects of meditation over the years. They've been in this field for decades. But they talk about how often it needs to be done to really receive some benefits. And what they've really come to believe is it doesn't take much time at all. Yes, the more you do it, the more benefits derive. But they've actually found that even frequent moments of mindfulness, formal or informal, can bring benefits to both the body and mind. So I'd love to invite people to at least challenge yourself for maybe a few days to try this particular practice, at least for 3 minutes each day, if not more. And one of the things that I've found in life is that when we practice something, it eventually becomes a skill. And for those that, how I view a skill, once it's a skill and you become proficient at it, it just becomes second nature. And to have a skill really take hold, there's three components. You have to have the knowledge of why it's important. You have to have the skill, the how to do it. And more importantly, you have to have the desire, the want to do something over and over again. So hopefully this afternoon, in this brief moment that we've had together, we've been able to impart maybe some of the importance of it, why it's so valuable for you. Maybe I was able to introduce just briefly some of the skill on how to do it, because that's a challenge for many people. But what I won't be able to do, but I'm hoping you brought with you today, was that desire. There was a reason each of you came to this session this afternoon, this series, this Wellness Wednesday, and that's for you to have. But if you have that desire to begin with, all it takes is a little practice, and then eventually it'll become a skill and something you'll do every day. With that, we're going to prepare to wrap this up, but I would like to invite you to do a little visualization exercise with me. One of the most peaceful places we have in Palo Alto at our disposal is Foothill Park. And in fact, when we started the city program, and I know I have AJ here from the HR department, who's my counterpart in the city resiliency program. And I know, AJ, you're probably smiling right now because this is where we used to host our classes for the city workforce, is up at Foothill Park, because it's a beautiful scenic environment that just naturally brings some peace of mind. And I know many residents are taking advantage of this, and not just residents, now that we've opened it up to the public, are finding that same value. But what I'd like to do with you is do one final practice with you, and it'll be very brief. But as we're looking at this photo, I'm going to ask you to partake in a visual exercise with me and go with me on this quick little journey. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that only you will have the answer to. But maybe when you sign off tonight, you'll really give some thought to the answers that arise within you and take it from there. I want, before we begin this, to say again how thankful I am to have the opportunity to join you this afternoon, and really how humble I am in being asked to do this with you this afternoon. We're always here for you. We're in this together. So don't ever hesitate to reach out to either myself or other members of the city to help us be a stronger community, both in overall wellness and personal well-being. So for this practice, what I'd like you to do is take yourself, if possible, and I know we're doing this from the comfort of our home or our office, and maybe there's somebody that's standing out there at Foothill Park right now experiencing this. But let's go on this little walk together and actually do it maybe with your eyes closed if you wish. But imagine as if we were truly there right now, standing by this dock. And then with just a few footsteps, we'd be able to walk onto that dock and come to the edge of the dock. And that's where I want to begin this practice. So I want you to take yourself and imagine being at the edge of this dock, feeling the clear water, sensing the peace, the serenity that you're surrounded by. And I would invite you to close your eyes once again and just try to clearly bring this image into your mind's eye, as if right now at 5:55 in the afternoon, you're standing at the edge of that dock, taking it all in and experiencing the peace and the joy. And as you're sensing the temperature, the air, maybe the wind going by you, maybe you're hearing sounds off in the distance. What I want you to visualize right now as you're standing there is that next to your foot, there happens to be a weight that was left behind. Maybe it's a fishing weight, but it's just a little metal weight. Maybe it's a stone. It could be a stone. It's your experience. So I want you to envision this object at your foot, and I want you to reach down, whether it's a stone or a fishing weight. And I want you to feel it as if it's in your hand right now. Sense the texture, the smoothness, the roughness, the weight. And then I want you, as you're holding it in your hand, I want you to give it back to nature. And I want you to reach out over the water, and I want you to drop that stone or that fishing weight into the water. And I want you to imagine that it starts to descend, as it will, into the depth of the lake. And as it's descending in the water, you can see it going deeper and deeper into the water. I want you to ask yourself this very basic question. In your heart of hearts, what is it that you truly want in your life? In your heart of hearts, what is it that you truly want in your life? An answer naturally arose within you. And it's something I want you to give some thought to, is if you have it in your life, that's a blessing. If you don't, what do I have to do to obtain it? And as that stone or that weight continues to descend in the depth of the water, I want you to ask the following question. In your heart of hearts, what is it you want to offer the world? In your heart of hearts, what is it that you want to offer the world? Those two answers, I would like you to reflect on as you sign off tonight. What is it that you truly want in your life? And what is it you want to offer the world? We can allow the stressors of life to become overwhelming, or we can reframe how we experience them. And maybe incorporating a little mindfulness will not only help us mitigate those stressors, but who knows, maybe it'll make us happier, nicer, more compassionate people along the way. So with that, when you're ready, I invite you to close your eyes. And I would like to one more time say thank you for this opportunity and wish you all the best and to stay safe and be well. So thank you for joining us tonight.